Okay. All right. So it's 7:01. Um, oh, thank you. I wonder who Nameless King is. I don't know who the people actually are, but if I know you and you want to say hi, hello. Anyway, so I'm gonna jump right into it. So hello everybody. My name's Helen Cheng. I'm a UX designer. I sometimes work on video games. Um, can't really talk about them, unfortunately, except for in a general way, like I'm going to right now. Um, oh, yay. No, thank you. I really appreciate that. I have my SD hat somewhere, but I'm not currently in SD. But just for context, like I'm on the IGA San Diego board. I've been a volunteer for a few years, and this is my first talk in a little bit. So hopefully this is helpful. The format is basically going to be I'm going to give my talk, and I think that'll go for about 30 minutes, possibly a bit longer. And then if anyone has extra questions at the end, they can be anywhere from like really basic to really like complicated. Like this talk is more for beginners, people who don't know a lot about UX. But if you are a UX designer and you want to ask me like how did you get into UX and stuff, you can just you're totally fine to ask that. I get it. Um, yeah, no problem. My phone's down here as I'm reading the chat that way. So yeah, Q&A will be at the end. So I will go ahead and get right into it. So unluckily, I do not have the rest of my slides so pretty, so it's gonna look like this for the rest of the time. Okay, so intro to games UX. So ignore the third bullet point. Um, the question is like, what is games UX? What is UX? What do UX designers do? What does it actually look like? I'm gonna move on to the next slide because it looks better than this. So UX stands for user experience, and UX is seen and mentioned a lot in tech. Like when you're using your phone, like using Google Maps, using Twitter, whatever, people are like, "Oh, the UX on here is so great," or "It's so awful," and it really turns people on, like toward or away your product. And when UX is in games, the user is really just the player. So user experience is basically the player experience, which is a very, very broad thing. And I'm not going to say that I work on everything. That's not possible. Um, so yeah, like what's the scope of a UX designer's role? So when it comes to player experience, like everyone has a role in making a really good player experience. If you take any game, but like if I said Zelda, right? Um, you have so many different people who work on different things, right? The combat designers refine the game feel of the combat mechanics. They work with level designers who take the mechanic and make really good levels to showcase that. And then those level designers work with environment artists who make it both functional and really pretty. And then we give all this stuff, like a mess of stuff, to software engineers who are like, oh my god, and they actually have to put it in the game engine. And this is like a very, very tiny sliver of like just hundreds of people that are usually required to make like bigger games. But of course, you don't have to have all those people. It's just that it depends on the scope. But the point is that everyone is responsible for contributing to the player experience. So, in that sense, all the disciplines have overlap, they have to work together, and UX designers cannot possibly own the entire thing, despite what our name might say. Um, so, what do we actually do? When they hear UX, people are thinking about usability, they're thinking about accessibility. Um, Very often, we get confused with UI, so you'll hear roles like UX UI, UI artist, UX designer. It's just all sort of jumbled. And then they think of playtesting, hopefully. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through each one very broadly, not UI as much because we're going to be showing a lot of that. Um, and if you have any questions, definitely keep that in mind and I'll answer them in the end. Though actually, if you do have any like really key questions that I see in the chat, I will probably respond. So, usability. Usability is all about making the game as easy as possible to use. When you are playing a game and you have to navigate way too many menu levels to get to what you need, that's really bad usability or really bad UX. Um, does the player understand what's happening on screen? If you ever play League of Legends and you're brand new to it and you see all these things happening at the same time, that can be very overwhelming, and you might not know what's going on, and that might make you feel bad. So that's also it can be a bad user experience. And on that note, with something like League of Legends, can the player learn the mechanics easily? So there is aspects of UX that is about like learnability, about onboarding, things like that. So there are some games that have really, really easy onboarding, like Tetris. You know what the game is, you know how to move the little things, but it's very hard to master. And then you have games like League of Legends where it'll take you months just to get to level 30 to play in like actual 5v5s and stuff like that. So there's a lot going on there. Usability is a very, very broad term. Um, and when it comes to usability, it's about understanding the player and where they're at when they approach your game. A lot of times when you are, let's say you're making a Nintendo game, a lot of the audience is very generalized, but they try to make games that are playable by kids. So kids have limited knowledge of how games work and just in general. And so they want to make it kid friendly, so they make things easy to use with their tiny little hands. And but they also consider that parents might want to play with it too, and they make it so that whatever they use for the tiny little hands for kids, their parents can play as well. Um, so, you know, that's one example. But if you, say, are making an MMO, right? There's a lot of companies that like to make MMOs. And when that happens, I'm specifying like MMORPG. Um, there is a standard, like World of Warcraft, right? So if you make an MMO and you you're going to get a lot of players who have played other MMOs coming to your game. That's going to be a large chunk of your audience. And they already have a preconceived idea of what the mechanics are. And so if you mess with what's been established, there has to be a really good reason for that because then they have to learn this new way of working. And so if you see a game like, let's say, Final Fantasy 15, whatever the latest one is, and they have these console controls with a bunch of different combinations of hotkeys in order to like uh, do combat and stuff. Um, People might get overwhelmed at first, but if they're committed to the bit, if they're committed to learning all those mechanics and stuff, it can be really, really rewarding. So it's all about understanding what is in their brains, what they know, and kind of going from there, bridging that gap. So here's a really good example of some questionable usability. So if anyone has played Animal Crossing New Horizons, they have this really great crafting mechanic. You have to craft to make anything in the game. And how it works, at least last I played, is that if you want to craft one item, it takes you 3 clicks and 5 seconds. And then you have to click another time in order to restart the whole process. So if you and things break all the time and you have to like constantly be making things in order to keep up with the game. And so every single time you make something, you have to wait and click and click and click. And the thing is that like why can't I make these things in bulk? Why do I have to like go through this whole animation sequence every single time I'm crafting? So Um, a good tentative solution, for example, would be like getting rid of all those extra clicks and allowing people to make a bunch of things at once by like just a simple
personal menu,
process.
we can have a system where they can still add.
So I'm going to mute this video and I'm just going to show what one person's solution is. It's not necessarily the best solution, but it's an idea. So instead of having like one clam, you craft it, you make one bait, it takes you 5 seconds each time. Here, they're allowing you to choose multiple resources and make 6 bait at a time. And you can lower it, you can increase it, you click craft, it makes all of it. Um, if that seems obvious, that's great. The problem is, this is not something that they ended up doing. Also, what happened to my screen here? It's like not full screen anymore. Here we go. So when New Horizons came out, everyone was complaining about that. They're all joking about it. A million people redesigned the UI, and for a long time they did not change it. I don't know if they still have changed it, left it as is. But the question is, why did they do it this way? And even though the usability on it is pretty poor, um, there are a lot of reasons as to maybe why they left it that way. Maybe it made sense with their gameplay um, core pillar of like living life slowly. It's a very cozy game where you want to take your time and enjoy it and not rush. Even though people definitely min-max the game, that may or may not be their intention. Um, Players could maybe abuse the function to do something that they don't want, like make way too many items and then manipulate like the turnip economy, like the turnips are like the stocks. Um, so who knows? Maybe there's something weird with that. Or maybe somehow it was not technologically feasible. They let people build things in bulk, and all of a sudden the whole game is broken. I wouldn't be surprised. There are weirder things have happened in other games. So we'll never really know as an outsider looking in, but it's food for thought. Usability may look worse on the outside, but sometimes there's a reason for doing things a certain way. Um, and in that sense, there's like idea of friction, which is that sometimes you want to make things slightly harder for a reason. So everything has to be for a reason to improve the player experience. So if you move on to the next thing, this is about accessibility. This is something that people talk about a lot. It's about making your product, or in this case, the game, usable, or in this case, playable by as many people as possible. So, if someone's colorblind, if someone is seizure prone, if someone broke their arm, if someone is pregnant and they can't lean over to pick up the controller that they just dropped. Like, there's a lot of different situations where someone's ability is different. And so, things that we might check for example, is like the font size. Is it too small to read? Do I have to squint in order to get it? Is the color contrast really harsh? If you put beige text on white background, I'm not going to be able to read it. Are the controls ergonomic? There are a lot of control schemes out there where you have to hold down the button in order for a very, very long time, and there are lots of people who can't do that. So once you force them to do this really painful task for them, they're not going to play your game. So these are all things that to consider. Um, there are levels of accessibility that you can like shoot for. Um, you want to try to get to at least some baseline, like being colorblind friendly. Um, there are very few games out there that is playable by literally everybody, but the more you cast your net, the more inclusive you can be is great. And also companies love it because then that means more people can buy the game or whatever. So something to be aware of. So really good example of UX. So Destiny has this really good system for accessibility where you can choose different colorblind modes. So you can like preview what the colorblind mode will look like when you choose it, or you can like and you could also like select based off like the most common um, colorblind thing. I don't know how to explain it. Color blindness that you have. So, very common is red green. So if you have that, you can click on that. Automatically, the rest of the game is playable. This is really important because a lot of things are color coded, which is also not ideal. Um, but when things are color coded and you can't distinguish between two colors, then that means you have to go into the game settings and change it to work for you. Another really important aspect of UX would be playtesting. So playtesting everyone knows is already a way to see if the game experience is working as intended. Um, but when it comes to what UX researchers specifically are doing, they're looking for certain things. So usually they set out a goal for the research session and say, I want to be able to see if they notice uh, this new like marker in like the in-game world, or if I want to see if this combat mechanic is really painful to use or if it feels as smooth as it should feel. Um, so some important questions that are very common in these is, do players miss important visual cues? Something in their environment that's supposed to convey information. Did they miss it? Um, do players know how to find something in their inventory? Considering things like the information architecture, or what some people say is system architecture of the game, is really important. Can players easily navigate their environment? Even though a lot of people think UX is about UI, um, it's not strictly about that. So if it's a bad player experience to walking around in your environment because you're constantly clipping against like the floor or something, that is bad UX. That's bad player experience, and we will note that and we will tell you. And you know, there's some overlap between QA and UX researchers. Um, that's kind of like what there was that slide in the beginning where we all work together on these things. Um, but user UX researchers are usually not trying to fix or find bugs. They're trying to see if something we made is even good to use. So Nintendo probably has to do a ton of um, playtesting in order to make like mounting a horse and running off as Link really smooth. So yeah, what most people do is that they watch people play certain features of the game. They'll have you come in, pay you like 20 an hour in order to watch you play the game. And they'll probably use a method called talking out loud, which is you play the game and you are required to try to speak what you're thinking as you're going through the environment. This is really hard for a lot of people to do, and so usually that means the researcher has to be good at asking the right questions at the right time, and having some experience but also intuition to know like when they're definitely thinking of something and they're stuck or like something doesn't make sense to them. So yeah, research is by itself a really huge part of UX. Usually in UX is like a design section and then a research section, and this research section is very, very underutilized. So, for example, you we have auto run and MMOs, right? I think when they first implemented this, they're probably thinking, oh man, it's so annoying to have to hold down W in order to run across the world or something. Can we just make it automatic? Okay, they set a button to it, people love it. Um, but there are some considerations to have when you implement something because games are usually these gigantic systems where doing one thing will affect the rest of the game in some way. So, some things we might study intentionally is, what do players do while they auto run? Um, what does that add to the player experience? Like, is there any opportunities for improvement, or does this actually worsen the player experience in some ways? So, probably, not probably, but like, I'm going to make some educated guesses here. When they playtested auto run for like World of Warcraft, they're probably like, what do people do when they auto run? A lot of people open their map in order to track where they're going. Um, a lot of people might be, like messing with the inventory if that's possible. Maybe they're messaging a friend, say, let's meet me up here or something. Oh, sorry. Um, Things like that. Some people still move the camera with their mouse in order to be auto running the correct direction. Um, and a lot of that kind of stuff can be found just by playing the game yourself or just watching people play, collecting all that data and seeing those opportunities to improve it. So, for example, if someone's checking their map a lot when they're auto running, perhaps they would better benefit if that map was a mini map in the top right corner, like how it is now, or if it was slightly translucent if they brought it up. And we can't do everything that players want, which is why there's a million mods for WoW and people can do a lot of crazy things specifically for their specific workflow. A lot of times when it comes to playtesting, you implement something, you don't know what's going to happen, and you want to see what the most common um, workflows are. When I say workflow, user flows. Like, what are the most common things that people do? And then, like, making that as polished as possible. Um, Another negative thing that might happen if you have auto run is Let's say you are not paying attention and you run straight off a cliff or into an enemy camp and they're like really high level and you're really low health and you die. Um, that is something you have to balance and say for yourself, is this worth letting users or letting players have this risk, have this danger to them? Will they get really frustrated when this happens? And ultimately, I think they decided that it was worth it for a lot of people. So, um, a lot of times people have thought about UX or used UX in some way in their life. Um, for example, if you're like scrolling through Twitter and all of a sudden you have two different feeds, like for you and or like following and something else general. You're like, why did this happen? When did this happen? I don't like one feed like whatsoever. And you think that's bad UX. That happens a lot. Um, but as a UX designer, there are some really basic things that like a very, very junior UX person would do, or a very not very mature UX company would do. And it's incidental knowledge. So this would be comparing to other games. So you're making a game, you're comparing it to other games. You're gonna see what you can borrow, cut. You can see like if your game is better than the other game, stuff like that. This is like the bare minimum. And if it sounds like game design, that's because it is. UX is like it's like a discipline within game design. You have generalists, and then you have like level, combat, UX, narrative designer, all these things. Um, a lot of UX designers make sketches or mock-ups or prototypes. Sketches can be things that you draw on paper. Mock-ups are more cleaned up versions of the paper things that you put on your screen, for example. So, like, if you ever use Figma or Adobe XD, actually, scratch that. Adobe XD is gone now because Adobe acquired Figma. If you ever used basically just Figma now, um, you are able to create um, examples of what is happening on the screen. So, for example, you can design a button and then you can design what it's like when you click that button, what menu does it bring up, stuff like that. And then prototypes. That's really, prototypes is basically um, taking those mock-ups and making them interactable. So instead of having like two screens, one is a button when you click on it, you can actually connect them so that, if you press play, that button is now actually clickable and you can see what it actually looks like to a user when they interact with it. This is really useful for UI, honestly, but it can be used for a lot of different situations. Um, then a lot of times UX designers, they get feedback from other designers. Um, this is a good and bad thing. It's mostly a good thing. I should say that. Getting feedback from other designers is really, really helpful. But if you're a UX designer in games, know that you are supposed to be the expert on UX, and it's really great to get feedback from others, especially because they're the ones making like the gameplay mechanic or something. And then intuition. A lot of people follow their intuition when making UX, um, and that's okay to start with. I mean, you're coming into this with information that you can use. They you are hopefully, if you're working as a UX designer, you had some training on like what are some very common um, usability patterns, or like what are some common like UX experiences that are considered good, and also what's bad so you can avoid those. This is really great when you're going into it, but it can sometimes be a pitfall for people because they rely too hard on their intuition and not like actually testing the product or seeing that there's a caveat or like a special exception to like using a button here or using a color there or something like that. So how can you be a better UX designer? So ideally, you do a couple different things. Is you have UX research basics and you have UX design basics. So UX research, the first things that you can start learning about is like competitive analysis, which is formally studying other games that you can learn from, and then writing down the comparisons. So a lot of times I work on some games sometimes. Um, A lot of times people say, "Oh, let's just copy how they do it in Overwatch," or "Let's just copy this." And the thing is that you, unless you're making that game is not your game, and you want to be able to pull the relevant parts of that and also identify what are the pros and cons of like said feature from other games. So let's say you're making uh, a shooting mechanic. You know, a lot of first-person shooters out there. Um, if you're making a shooting mechanic, luckily that's a very, very established game mechanic actually. So you could probably easily steal from a lot of different games uh, their UX, and you'll have a perfectly fine product. But the way that Overwatch implements their shooting mechanic may be very slightly different from like Apex Legends because they have different target audiences, they have different hitboxes, they have even very different mechanics. I mean, different kinds of guns and abilities and things like that, combinations of those as well. So that's why it's important to analyze your competition rather than just copying or whatever. Basic user flows. I realize I should show you what a user flow looks like, so I'm going to do that. UX user flow. Let me just actually click images. So user flows are kind of like this. And I'm going to choose this one just as like a very easy example. No, I don't want to open your link. Open image. So let's say, just like humor me here for a second. If you're making like a mobile game and you want to see what it looks like from one screen to the next, let's say you click on something and you reach a point where you have to choose between doing X or Y. Like you have to choose between like building a cabin or like feeding your soldiers. Or in this case for like, you know, Uber or whatever, it's like deciding whether you want like a large Uber or a small Uber or whatever. So like there are points where when you're using an application, or in this case if you're playing a game, there is a bunch of different decisions you can make. Um, a lot of people know about this via like a narrative decision tree. So if you pick one path, you go down there, you can't go back. That narrative decision happens, and that affects the rest of the game, what kind of endings you get. The same thing kind of happens in user flows, where if you click on this button, it brings you here. If you complete this quest, it unlocks this other quest, etc., etc. So these user flows can be applied to a lot of things, not just screens, but like I said, the quests, the narrative, and things like that. But being able to map that out, map the actual decision points, map the states that happen, um, is extremely, extremely helpful for showing what things actually will look like, um, for like planning out what the experience should be like. User flows can get very, first off, I love user flows. And second off, it can get really, really complicated but also useful because there is not, you can document a lot more than just states. You can also document thoughts, feelings, opportunities, actions. So one of my favorite projects I've ever worked on was documenting a user flow for like learning a mechanic, so like a tutorial. And we wanted to see what the player was thinking and feeling and doing while they're going through the flow. So the flow might document you press like this to jump and this to walk or whatever. Maybe you introduce something weird like this double click for dash or whatever. And then you present them with a challenge. Some things that you might document beyond just the basics is stuff like, do they feel frustrated at this point of the flow? Do they feel really excited by this point in the flow? Like, what is causing that thought? Like, do they think, oh, this is new, I really like it? Or do they think, wow, this is really stupid and I don't want to learn it, how can I skip it? You know? Really great example is if you're playing uh, uh, a game where you know the mechanics because you've seen it before and you just want to skip, skip, skip. And there is a certain path that players tend to go down in order to just skip the tutorial. So if we recognize those cues in the flow, we can provide a way for them to kind of just skip the whole thing. So I think they have something like that in Elden Ring where you can fall down this pit and do this tutorial if you want, um, and they give you tips. They give you a hint saying like, "Hey, this is kind of like the tutorial thing," or you can just skip it entirely, and that can be documented very literally with the user flow. It's called cognitive mapping, but that gets really complicated, and you could probably tell I could talk about that forever. So I'm gonna keep moving forward. And then basic playtesting. So playtesting is not just watching someone and asking them questions. It's also writing down notes. It's recording data of when they click this or that. Um, it's tracking their eyes and be able to see what they're looking at and why they're looking at it. So there's a lot of different things you can do for playtesting, but those things can be honestly the most important things that you can learn. Um, a lot of times, a lot of companies um, don't have very mature UX methods. I've worked in tech companies, I've worked in game companies. Usually, tech companies they have a much simpler product, so you can apply so many cool UX methods to them. But when it comes to games, the system is huge and hulking and very hard to change and improve over time. It requires everyone working in step, and so implementing like really basic methods first is probably the most cost efficient and most widespreading um, way to improve the UX of the game. Um, so if you can get this down and you work in your company and you do this stuff, that will honestly make a huge difference. And then anything extra you learn, like cognitive mapping or whatever, would be really great. But your company may or may not be ready for that. So UX design, the pit was a little too easy to miss initially. Honestly, good freaking point. Um, I there's so okay. I can go into a whole thing about that. But there are different kinds of player types, right? And so different type of player types may or may not miss the pit, the tutorial pit. Um, and you kind of have to account for all these different types. Like your players are not just one monolith who like, oh, I get it, that's a tutorial, I'm gonna skip it or whatever. Um, there are some people who might accidentally fall into the pit. There are some people like me who will literally inspect every single thing in the environment, and I will not leave until I figure it out. Um, so it's a lot to consider. And if you're making a game for so many people, millions of people, then you want to make sure that you account for at least the most common ones. I didn't fall in the pit. I don't know if it's a good thing. Well, I mean, if you already are familiar with Souls-like games and you intentionally missed the pit because you knew it was a tutorial, that went as intended. That's great. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. There's always a trade-off between letting things go wrong versus like forcing them down like a very linear path where the experience is very perfect. We could talk about that. UX design basics. Oh man, I'm taking a long time on this slide. I'm sorry. So basic usability rules, you really have to learn those. That's necessary. I have resources at the end of this slides, and if you want to learn more. Basic prototyping. This is so freaking helpful. You don't have to know how to code. If you can use Figma, even if you only know like Photoshop or whatever, you can prototype really easily. And this is really good at conveying states and motion and literally like if there's a flow where there's a step one and step two, you can show that. And then basic accessibility. I think hopefully everyone has some basic accessibility knowledge, like don't make your font size 2 pixels or whatever. But there's more you can learn. They're very easy to apply. It's almost like textbook stuff. So, but if everyone did this, oh my gosh, so many games would be so much better. Okay, what's missing from most games UX? So I'm gonna talk about this a little bit, but I'm not gonna go into depth unless people want me to. User research methods. So many companies are usually limited to just playtesting, surveys, and telemetry. Telemetry being like figuring like just data, like how many times people open their map or recall or whatever. But they considered cognitive mapping. Um, I love cognitive mapping, and I think it's really helpful, and people don't use it enough. I already talked about it enough. Design artifacts. So design systems. Oh my goodness. If people had a source of truth that said this is how like this part of the UI works every time. This is how jumping in the game works every time. Game designers, like 90% of the job is like documentation, and then no one reads the documentation, and then people start making things that are offshoots of the documentation of like what was decided, and then you have this huge mess where everyone has like 5 different ways of like walking. And if people, if there was a system in order to submit um, design rules and people follow those rules, then you would really, really minimize tech and design debt because we're all following the same rules. Cognitive flowcharts and journey maps. I already talked about cognitive mapping slash flowcharts. Journey maps is kind of like that, um, but documenting a very specific journey. So, for example, the journey of your first quest line. Um, what is that like for the player? What do they learn? Whatever's and then system architecture. A lot of games are very, very complicated. They have many different game loops and mechanics and just a billion things interacting with each other. It's like a nightmare. So you have, ideally, you document that so that you don't lose something and then you realize, oh shoot, I didn't update that screen. Or oh shoot, all the grass in this other area is like not the right color. Um, or oh, I didn't account for like the clouds interacting with the rain and now like it's breaking everything in the game. So documenting systems is really helpful, and just creating a single document of what rain does is not enough. You kind of have to see how that interacts with all the other systems in the game. And then last but not least, UX outside of interfaces. You oh, that is related to the question. So is UI and UX interdependent? Um, I would say that UX, I would say that those two are the most commonly intertwined, um, because the games industry doesn't know enough about UX, so that's what they think it is. UX is player experience, which means that whatever methods you learn here can be applied to pretty much anything ever. Not even just in games, but I'm like the way you design like apps or like your house or like anything. It's about like the experience of the person using it. And so if you learn these things, you might end up optimizing a lot of things, not just UI, but like your life. And I'm a very organized person, so maybe that's just what ended up happening to me. Um, yeah, so that kind of goes with this last point with UX outside of interfaces. So not just the game UI, that's what I meant to write, not just web or mobile, like making the Steam page or making like the Nintendo app with the or with their games, but the actual gameplay benefits from UX. Like you want to know what players are thinking when they uh, use your new combat mechanic for the first time? Do you want to know what players are thinking when they're experiencing your level for the first time? Um, do you want to know if the colors on your boxes actually mean please destroy these boxes or not? All of these things, some people have basic UX knowledge so they can answer these questions for themselves, but a lot of these things would benefit if you had an expert who is staring at it and said, here's a way to make this like so much better. So I'm trying to, there are some games where they do consider UX early on in the game design process, but a lot of times, so my experience is that a lot of game designers kind of assume very basic UX, and then they make the document and then they give it to a UX designer who has to then fix all the UX things that they didn't consider. So, I mean, that's partly why games is so difficult, right? Like you make something and then you realize that there's a billion other people who needs to improve it. Um, but yeah, these are all really expensive methods because these are all they take more time. Um, they're really helpful. They're really valuable. They give so much insight. But if you're just trying to crank things out, you're not trying to like think about it too critically. Like if you're making like another very very generic MMO RPG, then like yeah, you don't have to do that much UX, but that's too bad, you know. So, on that note, I went a little bit over. I just wanted to say that UX is a growing field. They have their own summit. They have their own masterclass at GDC. I don't really endorse masterclasses, but I'm just saying that it is a more established thing in the games industry. We have our own professional group. So there's games research and user experience. It's a whole thing. You can get a mentor. You can learn more. Their website is super good. Um, and it's generally become more of an established discipline in the overall tech industry with games in catching up. So UX designer at like Google or Fang or whatever, that is very solid. They on the maturity scale, they're like the top of the scale, and games are like in the baby maturity stage. So if you become a UX designer, you can have a lot of opportunities to improve UX within games, which is what I'm trying to do. And yeah, that is basically it. Thank you for listening. I have a couple different things here, one for research, one for design, just some links to some games, UX stuff, or just general UX stuff that's really helpful. Um, I just would encourage you to like kind of look through these and learn as much as you can on your own. It's very, very easy to learn, I think, but it just takes time. And I'll just go ahead and stop talking and then see if there are any questions. So I can take questions for the next 15 minutes or up until 8 p.m. So cool, cool. Let me go ahead and check the chat. Amy Pendant says, think of how Apple lays out the devices and product boxes. That's the UX in a physical setting. Oh my God, thank you for saying that because I love that people are thinking about it beyond just like apps or something. Um, yeah, I think that what people call the physical designers, they typically call them like industrial designers. And these are all different names for some of the same disciplines. But what's really great about industrial designers is they consider the ergonomics of like how easy it is to take the phone out of the box and like, is it going to protect it enough in transport and stuff. And so they have knowledge about packaging that I would never have. And so there's so much depths that people can go into. But honestly, starting as a generalist is still really helpful. So cool. Okie dokie. I think that that's good so far. Okay, so let's see. Rono Arts says, how does a UX designer show strength of work when applying for the position? Do they need to have worked on their own game documentation of mockups? That is a good question. So the easiest way to become a UX designer in games is to be a UX designer outside of games first, and then taking that experience and applying to UX game jobs. It's really helpful because you show that you have a record of working on UX, knowing usability, knowing a lot of like the rules and the methods and stuff. And honestly, if they hire a UX designer from outside of the games, they're they're honestly bringing a lot of knowledge that the game company probably doesn't have. So yeah, how you show your strengths. So there's a lot of examples of UX design portfolios out there. Research too, but I'm just like in general UX portfolios. And typically for more junior people, the best way to show your portfolio is to show a case study, ideally multiple case studies. It doesn't have to be of a game, but it has to be showing your process. So if anyone's familiar with um, like Norman Nielsen's, what's it called, design thinking, if you're able to show that you're able to follow those steps, consider things holistically and then show what you did at every step, like sketches, the mock-ups, wireframe, prototypes, testing. If you can show all that stuff and you can show that you're considerate, um, you're, then that's honestly all you need. If you can do that, plus show that um, you are passionate about games, like you make game jams, maybe you do an analysis of a game's UX, then that honestly is really helpful. It's way easier if you have experience outside of games first. But if you're going for it as a junior, um, then try to find internships or like get experience in other ways. It's very hard to get like a junior UX design role without like that kind of background. So, yeah. Let's see. Are there sometimes a UX team, or does the position usually held by one person? Can team members disagree? Um, Usually depends on the game and the scope of the game. So for AAA games, there's usually, I hope that there is usually a UX team. Usually the team is made up of a few different designers, um, and you may have like a UX manager. And typically they have these hierarchies where the UX manager is like a product owner, so they have final say on a lot of things. But UX and or actually just design in general is about like healthy discussion and debate. So yeah, you could definitely disagree with someone, say, hey, I think that this is not following best practice, or like it's breaking this usability rule, or maybe you're not on the same page and you want to make sure that you're good, so you ask questions. Um, Everyone has their own strengths, so I think that you know it makes sense that people aren't perfect at everything, and they'll probably give each other feedback. But if you are the sole UX designer on a game, um, that gives you a lot of opportunity to make a lot of impact, but that's rough, honestly. Okay. All right. Thank you for it. Yeah, no problem. There's two different llama usernames. Nice. Um, okay, I hope that this was helpful. I'm not gonna lie, I had a UX talk before this stream, and I looked at it before the stream, and I was like, this is not good enough. So I scrapped it and remade it. Hence why there are so many things with just text on them. Um, That being said, I am really passionate about UX. I hope it came off that I know a lot. And if you have any questions, literally at all, please hit me up. I'm in the IGDA San Diego Discord. I'm Mei Chung on there, and you can just DM me. I'll answer any question. I can give you feedback on your portfolio. I can help you with career stuff. It doesn't matter. I'm just here to help everyone out. Uh, Cool. Yes, thank you so much. I will go ahead and end the stream now. And let me know if you have questions. Just reach out to me on Discord. Okay. Goodbye.